On the program, Ukraine Today. Russia is shelling Ukraine in the freezing cold because of strikes on the energy sector. At the beginning of January, about half of the residential buildings in Kyiv were left without electricity and heat. For a week, energy workers have been eliminating the consequences of the accidents. European countries want to send their troops to the island of Greenland. Is Europe preparing for war with the USA? Will Trump be able to buy or seize Greenland? Why does he want the island? What does Russia and China have to do with it? What is happening on the front lines in Ukraine right now? For the first time in decades, explosions occurred on 3 oil tankers in the Mediterranean Sea. All of them had recently called at Russian ports. After Trump became president, civilian deaths in Ukraine increased. Why? I've gathered for you the most important and significant news about Russia's war against Ukraine from the past week. My name is Yulia Kort. Good evening. What is the price Russia pays to capture a single city in northern Ukraine, according to intelligence assessments provided by the British military? During the battles for the recapture of Kupiansk, Ukraine's defense forces eliminated 27 times more Russian soldiers than they lost themselves. A source in the Ministry of Defense reported that before Christmas, up to 200 Russian soldiers were surrounded in the Kupiansk area. The exact number of casualties is not disclosed, but the losses of the Russian Federation's army in this area during 2025 are estimated to be in the thousands. Ukrainian soldiers continue to fight for the freedom and independence of Ukraine, liberating and defending every meter of our land from the Russian occupiers. What is happening on the front and around it at this very moment is covered in our military report.
The first attempt to break through the border this year. In the Kyiv region, the occupiers tried to advance toward the village of Degtyarn. The attack was repelled, and more than 24 assault troops were eliminated, according to the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine.
The Guard Brigade of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine thwarted an attempt by Russian occupiers to break through the state border in the Kyiv region. The incident occurred near the village of Degtyarn. The problem is that after such incursions, the Russian armed forces apparently lack the strength to build on their success. So last year they were unable to establish any significant new footholds on the Ukrainian side of the border. And let's hope they won't succeed this year either. In
the defense forces, they note previously the enemy would appear in small groups near the border, probably probing the situation. But at the beginning of this week, for several days, having gathered a certain amount of their forces in small infantry groups, but in large numbers, they tried to attack the positions of the border.
Units are standardized quantities used to express the magnitude of physical properties, providing a consistent framework for measurement, comparison, and calculation across various scientific disciplines and everyday applications.
At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces are recording increased enemy activity along almost the entire line of contact. The most tense situation remains in the Zaporizhia direction. In addition to the ongoing assaults on Huliaipol, fighting has resumed with renewed intensity for the settlement of Stepnohirsk. The enemy's main objective is to advance closer to the regional center.
If Stepnohirsk ends up completely in the red zone, and the enemy is already directly in the area of this estuary, then obviously the enemy will be able to gain a foothold in this location, bring in the necessary artillery, both tube and rocket artillery. They would then be able to directly shell the suburbs of Zaporizhia and possibly Zaporizhia itself, particularly the southern part of the city.
However, since this has not happened yet, analysts believe the command still has time to hold this direction and reinforce the defense here with additional reserves. Moreover, despite the fact that the enemy has entered the city, it is not possible to speak of any real control over the territory.
On the other hand, nevertheless, it is important to note that in
the reports of Putin's generals, everything has long since been captured. For example, just the other day, while reporting on successes at the front, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, exaggerated Russian achievements threefold, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Stories about capturing territory. Since the beginning of 2026, the claims about 8 settlements and more than 300 square kilometers of territory have turned out to be lies. At the same time, for some reason, Gerasimov didn't mention the truth, namely how many people Russia lost over those 2 weeks. 14,120 soldiers, but that's not in the reports. There, everyone is advancing victoriously.
According to Gerasimov, the troops of the West Group are also engaged in street fighting and are completing the liberation of Kupiansk Uzlovyi. On Tuesday, a video was published showing a Russian strike with Fabi 500 aerial bombs, reportedly near Kupiansk-Uzlovy, according to the Institute for the Study of War. This indicates that positions in this area are also held by the Ukrainian armed forces. According to the deep state map, Kupiansk-Uzlovy is fully controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces, and this makes sense if you look at the map and Russia's positions in Kupiansk.
Gerasimov also did not forget to mention Pokrovsk in his reports. In the city, which according to official documents has been captured for several months, Russia somehow managed to advance again. But in reality, even this did not happen.
Right now, we can say for certain that part of the territory of Pokrovsk, primarily the northeastern section of the high-rise district, is under the control of the Ukrainian army.
At the same time, the situation in the assault units indirectly confirms that the number of Russian losses corresponds to reality. According to the soldiers, in recent months, the number of foreigners among the prisoners has increased significantly. This points to two problems at once. First, there are too few Russians left. And second, Putin is afraid of those who remain.
Putin is well aware of all the socioeconomic risks associated with launching the next wave of mobilization, whether partial or even more so, full mobilization. In order to prevent these negative, destructive processes in the Russian Federation, Russian emissaries are literally searching all over the world for people willing to earn money. That's why the ranks of the Russian army now include natives of countries from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
However, the Ukrainian armed forces are not picky. Ukraine is ready to destroy anyone who comes to our land with war. In the past 24 hours, their number has decreased by 1,370 people, fewer.
There are no power plants left in Ukraine that have not been damaged by the Russian army. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the Russian army has damaged every single Ukrainian energy infrastructure facility at least once. The head of Ukraine's Ministry of Energy, Denis Shmyhal, stated that the Russians are using their entire arsenal to damage critical infrastructure, from missiles before drones. In 2025, the Russian military attacked energy facilities at least 612 times, twice a day. He emphasized that recently strikes have been carried out daily. The Ukrainian power grid lost several thousand megawatts of electricity due to Russian strikes. Despite this, it maintains its integrity. The situation is worst in Kyiv and Kyiv region, as well as in Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv regions, and in the frontline areas. This is due to the load on the damaged grid. Electricity supply restrictions are being introduced in Ukraine. Bloomberg reports that the servicing companies are running out of equipment and critical spare parts. Russia is cutting off Ukraine's power during the freezing weather. This is due to strikes on the energy sector. At the beginning of January, about half of the residential buildings in Kyiv were left without electricity and heat. For a week, energy workers have been dealing with the aftermath of the accident following Russian strikes. The United Kingdom has announced an additional $26 million in support for Ukraine's energy infrastructure to strengthen the country's energy security. This comes after intensified Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy sector. Who will follow the example of the foggy Albion? We'll tell you more next.
On January 16th, the government of the United Kingdom announced a new comprehensive additional aid package of £20 million sterling, which is equivalent to over $20 million US, in order to provide critical support for the stabilization of Ukraine's energy infrastructure.
Ukraine is grateful to all international partners who have responded to the call to increase contributions to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund during this difficult time for the energy system and for all of Ukraine this winter.
These funds are intended to help strengthen Ukraine's energy security amid the constantly increasing Russian attacks on the energy sector.
Thanks to this vital international initiative, in the month of December last year, the fund successfully managed to fulfill a critical request for a total of 350 million euros. Of course, it is important to recognize that this is still not nearly enough, especially when considering the catastrophic and widespread damage deliberately inflicted on Ukraine's vital civilian energy infrastructure during the 10 massive and combined Russian strikes that have occurred since October of last year. These attacks have caused unprecedented levels of destruction across the entire national power grid. Even the very smallest individual contributions to meet the urgent technical needs of energy companies that submit their specific requests to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund are considered to be extremely important and valuable. And the significant contribution from the United Kingdom to this collective fund is very important and necessary.
After the president of Ukraine declared a state of emergency in the energy sector, assistance from partners can improve the situation in providing heat and electricity for millions of families, children, and elderly people.
The fact that at temperatures of minus 15 to 20 degrees, Russia is deliberately shelling thermal power plants whose operations have nothing to do with the activities of the armed forces of Ukraine or Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Since these specific thermal power plants provide only essential heating, offering centralized heating services exclusively to civilian institutions and local residents, this systematic targeting constitutes a clear war crime. It confirms the undeniable fact that Russia does not shy away from using even those brutal tools, those extreme means that were not used by either the Italian fascists or the German Nazis during their historical occupations. This level of aggression represents a new and terrifying escalation in modern warfare tactics.
The funds are planned to be used to provide vital emergency assistance for repairs, restoration, protection, and ensuring energy supply across the country, so that during harsh winter conditions, homes, hospitals, and schools continue to have electricity and heating.
After each large-scale and devastating aerial strike, energy workers are forced to immediately implement both critical emergency and completely unscheduled power outages. Comprehensive restorative and technical repair work is typically carried out over a period of several consecutive days or even up to a full week. Then, once the overall situation is gradually stabilized and brought under control, the specific schedules for stabilization outages for the general population are officially reinstated and put back into effect, featuring up to 2 distinct rounds and organized schedules. Power restrictions are imposed on industry.
As a rule, this happens during the daytime, primarily during peak hours. Following the conclusion of those specific events, the overall situation continues to remain remarkably and consistently stable right up until the very moment that the subsequent strike eventually occurs in the sequence.
The Prime Minister of Great Britain, Keir Starmer, stated that the people of Ukraine should have no doubt Britain will stand with them today, tomorrow, and for the next 100 years, both at home and on the international stage. Since the beginning of 2025, at least 20 civilian tankers connected to Russia or its shadow fleet have been damaged, attacked, or detained. The frequency of such incidents increased noticeably at the end of 2024. For the first time in a decade, explosions occurred on 3 oil tankers in the Mediterranean Sea. All of them had recently called at Russian ports. The Italian authorities considered the possibility of a terrorist attack, but there are still no official conclusions. A similar explosion occurred in the summer off the coast of Libya involving a tanker that had also previously visited Russian ports. In the Baltic Sea, 2 more tankers near the port of Ust-Luga sustained damage from an explosion. In both cases, external interference was considered, but the authorities did not provide detailed explanations. Since the fall of 2024, ships associated with Russia have begun to be attacked by Ukrainian armed forces maritime drones. Fires broke out on the tankers Virat and Kairos, as well as on a number of other vessels belonging to the so-called Grey Oil Zone. In January 2025, drones attacked the tankers Delta Hermani and Matilda near a terminal off the Russian city of Novorossiysk. In addition, a number of vessels from Russia's shadow fleet were detained and inspected by the authorities of Estonia, France, and the United States. Putin once again emerged from his bunker and made a series of senile statements. For example, Putin stated that in order to achieve peace in Ukraine, it is necessary to return to discussions about a new security architecture, which was proposed by Russia itself. Our journalists know what else the bunker cannibal had to say. In
Moscow, another award ceremony, applause, and the obligatory long speech by Vladimir Putin formally about peace and security. In fact, it's the same set of accusations, justifications, talk of war, and shifting the responsibility for aggression against Ukraine onto the rest of the world. The bunker dictator, who has been waging a full-scale war for the 4th year now, is once again talking about peace. As if the destroyed Ukrainian cities and hundreds of thousands of victims have nothing to do with him.
Peace does not come by itself. It is built, and every single day. Peace requires effort, responsibility, and a conscious choice about
choice and responsibility, Putin talks a lot. However, he never specifies who exactly made the choice to start the war and who should bear responsibility for it. But as usual, the Kremlin once again paints a picture of the world where Russia is the victim and everyone else are the aggressors.
Instead of dialogue between states, we hear a monologue from those who, by the right of the strong, consider it acceptable to impose their will, take lives, and give orders.
The irony is that this monologue of the strong is coming precisely from the Kremlin against the backdrop of ultimatums in Ukraine, annexed territories, and missile strikes on civilian infrastructure. However, in Putin's version, it's all different. The West is to blame, the neighbors are to blame, anyone is to blame except Russia.
Dozens of countries around the world suffer from the disregard of their sovereign rights, from chaos and lawlessness. And they do not have the strength or resources to stand up for themselves.
Putin is especially eager to talk about sovereignty, despite the fact that it is Russia that openly denies Ukraine's right to exist independently. But according to this logic, Moscow is supposedly the defender of the oppressed and a fighter for a just.
The world order is a complex system of international relations designed to maintain global stability, foster cooperation among nations, and uphold a framework of international law and shared security. Both are national interests and the objective trends of global development.
According to the Kremlin, a constructive course means tanks abroad, occupation of territories, and nuclear blackmail. At the same time, Putin once again refuses to call the war against Ukraine by its name, instead describing it as a forced measure for the sake of Russia's security.
Security must truly be comprehensive, which means equal and indivisible. Disregarding these fundamental, vital principles has never led to anything good and never will. This was clearly demonstrated by the crisis around Ukraine, which became a direct consequence of years of ignoring Russia's legitimate interests and a deliberate policy of creating threats to our security, of moving the NATO bloc closer to Russia's borders, contrary to the public promises made to us. I want to emphasize this. In
this version of history, Ukraine is reduced to just a crisis, and the invasion is presented as a supposedly logical consequence of other people's decisions. Of course, Putin does not mention missile strikes on residential buildings, deportations, or war crimes.
Let me remind you that Russia has repeatedly put forward initiatives to build a new, reliable, and fair architecture of European and global security. We proposed options and rational solutions that could satisfy everyone in America, Europe, Asia, and around the world.
According to the Kremlin, these initiatives should be discussed on Russian terms, with recognition of the seized territories and Ukraine's renunciation of its right to its own security.
We believe that it would be worthwhile to return to a substantive discussion of these matters in order to formalize the conditions under which a settlement can be reached, and the sooner, the better. A peaceful resolution of the conflict in Ukraine.
By a peaceful resolution, Moscow still means the capitulation of Kyiv. And while Putin talks about a long-term peace, the Russian army continues its offensive, and war remains the main instrument of the Kremlin's foreign policy.
It is precisely a long-term and sustainable peace, one that reliably guarantees the security of everyone that our country is striving for. Not everyone is ready for this, including in Kyiv and the capitals that support it. But we hope that the realization of this necessity will come sooner or later. In
January 2025, Donald Trump became president of the United States. Even before winning the election, he had declared his intention to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. But the statistics show the opposite. Russia began killing more civilians in Ukraine after Trump took office as president of the United States. In 2025, around 2,400 civilians were killed in Ukraine as a result of Russian shelling. Another approximately 12,000 were injured, which is 30% more than the previous year, according to Bloomberg. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated at a closed meeting with members of the European Parliament that the European Union aims to become a military superpower without losing its economic strength. Meanwhile, American President Donald Trump continues to insist that Greenland is necessary for the United States to strengthen its national security. European countries want to send their troops to the island. Is Europe preparing for war with the USA? Will Trump be able to buy or seize Greenland? Why does he need the island? What do Russia and China have to do with it, and why would this mean the end of NATO? All the details are in the report. In
the USA, the series about Greenland and Trump's expansionist plans continues.
If the US doesn't enter Greenland, Russia and China will go there. Denmark can't do anything about it, but we can do everything.
Just the other day, the White House released a statement about Greenland having to choose between the US and Russia with China. Trump insists that Greenland is essential to US national security. According to NBC News, the US has already estimated the possible purchase of Greenland at around $700 billion. That's more than half of the annual budget of the Pentagon. According to Trump, the US wants to deploy a new air defense system, the Golden Dome, in Greenland, which they are building. However, what is stopping Washington from doing this now within NATO? Given the presence of a permanent American military base on the island, the White House is not commenting. In addition, along with its strategic military importance, experts point out that the island is rich in natural resources: iron ore, graphite, tungsten, palladium, vanadium, zinc, gold, uranium, copper, and oil. The greatest attention is drawn specifically to the rare earth elements. Most importantly, without them, the defense industry would simply cease to function. For example, a single F-35 fighter jet contains more than 400 kilograms of rare earth elements. In 2025, during the height of the trade war between the US and China, when Trump tried to impose protective tariffs on Chinese exports in several waves, Beijing blocked their supplies to America, effectively putting entire sectors of American manufacturing on hold. Including the defense sector,
Greenland ranks 8th in the world in terms of rare earth element reserves. However, up until now, there has been no mining on the island. The harsh Arctic climate hinders mining activity on most of the island for the majority of the calendar year. Only 20% of Greenland is free of ice. However, the melting of glaciers due to global warming is opening up access to additional mineral resources as well as to new shipping and transportation routes. Experts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
when New York Times journalists asked the US president what was more important to him, acquiring Greenland or preserving NATO, Trump admitted that such a choice might arise.
The transatlantic alliance is essentially useless without the United States. It is at its core. I think we will always get along with Europe, but I want them to come to their senses. It was me who made them spend more money on NATO.
No one is interested in this, and what Trump says about them already taking Greenland is most likely just elements of traditional Trump diplomacy. Diplomacy of bluffing, intimidation, and blackmail. In other words, right now he's putting forward such arguments in the hope that the Europeans will simply show weakness, get scared, and accept his demands.
For now, one thing is clear. The US has made its role in NATO perfectly clear. It will no longer be the same as before.
The United States, again, even if they don't go and seize Greenland by military force, still, in the strategy published by the Trump administration, it is clearly stated that Europe should be concerned about its own security, on its own. In other words, the United States will, of course, provide assistance, but only assistance, not protection. And it's hard to say what the future holds for NATO, but in any case, it's no longer realistic to expect that the United States will unconditionally defend Europe.
For her part, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated at a closed session of the European Parliament that the EU respects the right of Greenlanders to make decisions independently. But they can count on the Europeans. The media reports that von der Leyen said the European Union is working to become a military power while maintaining its status as an economic giant.
That we are not a military state, but we are preparing to become one.
According to her, the Union must develop its own security strategy.
The European statements that Europe must restore its military potential to acquire it are, in fact, not accidental. And in principle, this is all connected to the United States, but not directly.
Is Europe really preparing for a war with the US in light of Trump's expansionist ambitions? After all, in recent months, the EU has significantly increased its defense capabilities.
As for a hypothetical war between Europe and the United States, it's too early to talk about that for now. And overall, such a scenario doesn't seem realistic. I think for now. At this stage, the confrontation between Europe and the United States, along with London, is predominantly political in nature. And the military arguments being used in this context are purely demonstrative. So I think that in any case, the conflict between Europe and the United States will be resolved economically and diplomatically, not militarily.
But that's not all. Europe is sending troops to save Greenland from the US. However, their numbers can only make you smile. France is sending 15 people, Germany 13, Norway 2 people, Sweden 3, the United Kingdom 1, Finland 2 people, and the Netherlands 1 person. The plan is for these troops to help Denmark, which Greenland is a part of, prepare for major military exercises. At the end of 2026, Of course, this is not a contingent meant for physical defense, but rather a political gesture to demonstrate the unity of the North Atlantic Alliance in the face of a threat. But White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated on January 15th that the deployment of European troops to Greenland will not affect President Trump's intention to make this territory American.
I don't think the presence of European troops will influence the president's decision-making process or his goal of acquiring Greenland. The president has made it clear what his priority is. He believes that it is in the best interest of national security for the United States to acquire Greenland. And
while the international community is concerned about the fate of Greenland, Trump's next target could be Iceland. By the way, Iceland is a key link in NATO's anti-submarine defense. The country's infrastructure is used to monitor underwater activity and track the movement of Russian submarines heading into the Atlantic from northern bases. Well, for the time being, why don't we take a moment to head over to the kitchen and grab ourselves a large, buttery bucket of freshly popped popcorn so that we can settle in comfortably and get ready to enjoy the show that is about to begin. Strength to the Ukrainian defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Subscribe, leave a like, and see you next time.